going to continue here with the very end of the last one with what is called Wanda's story, and then I will continue with the title of this video, which is Myths About the Self, with the final one from the last section. Wanda's story. Wanda had grown up with the sense that she had two fathers. Some of the time her father was a responsible businessman who provided well for his family and was fun-loving, generous, and caretaking. Other times he was an alcoholic father whose week-long binges would throw the family into disarray and fear. Wanda was 17 when her father's death in a boating accident allowed her to bury her alcoholic and irresponsible father, leaving only the memory of the good and loving daddy. Excuse me. Excuse me. When he would drink, Wanda's father lost all control. He failed to come home for weeks at a time. He neglected to pay bills and to take care of his responsibilities. All of the family's money, even the grocery allowance, was used to pay his bar bill. Wanda remembers one occasion when the three children gathered around the dinner table and had to make do with a few stale biscuits. If her father reappeared during a binge, his behavior would be out of control. He would rage around the house, screaming, fighting with her mother, and then falling asleep in the middle of the living room floor. Occasionally, he would go out in the neighborhood and stumble into someone's yard, sometimes threatening to bang on the windows and break down the door. Often, the police would be called. Sometimes neighbors would have to join in restraining him. As the only daughter in her family, Wanda had a special relationship with her father. She always thought that if she loved him enough and paid enough attention to him, she could somehow fix him. A myth about relationships that regrettably Wanda took into her first unsuccessful marriage. As a child, Wanda was known as Daddy's little girl, and when her father was feeling good and had sufficient money, he would always buy special presents for his beloved daughter. Wanda reciprocated. When her mother would periodically throw him out of the house, it was Wanda's mission to sneak him food and supplies. As a girl, Wanda had never been able to reconcile these two conflicting images of her father. For her, he was both the out-of-control, abusive alcoholic, and also the generous and loving father. When he died, Wanda buried her alcoholic father. In her mind and her imagination, she kept alive the man who had been her support and her patron. Wanda had been unable to fix her father while he was alive. Death gave her the opportunity to repair him to her liking. When she tells people about her father, she only remembers the popular, funny, gregarious man who loved to sing in the church choir. Unlike Troy and Liz, who came to realize that the image of the ideal parent was an invention of their own imaginations, Wanda continues as a woman in her mid-40s to believe in her perfect father. And like Eleanor Roosevelt, she, too, tends to hold idealized and often unrealistic views of all those for whom she cares. Kitty, whose father died after a long illness and a short but difficult life, had a somewhat easier time fixing up her father's image. 10 priests eulogized her father at his funeral as a salt-of-the-earth, hard-working man. Kitty had much support for starting to see her father as a tragic figure destroyed by a rough life. She says, "Death miraculously cleansed him of any bad qualities." When she thinks of her father now, she imagines a man who understands and respects the work she does, who is proud of her and who forgives her for any mistakes she makes because he knows that she tries hard. The father who failed in his many attempts to give up the cigarettes that eventually killed him has disappeared. His small town prejudices were forgotten along with his many misguided business ventures that nearly bankrupted the family. His passive voice that had failed to ever tell her of his love and concern vanished on the day of his funeral. Kitty's remembered father is indeed a new and better dad. Myths about the self, the next category in chapter 4, from the loss that is forever. In the same way a child is likely to create a myth about the parent who has died, he or she may create a set of false beliefs about the self. These self fantasies seem to fall into two distinct categories. Fantasies about who the child is, usually tied to some notion of bad karma or culpability for the parent's death, and fantasies about who the child might have become if the parent had lived, replete with images of an ideal self who would have been nurtured by the relationship with the now deceased parent. The mythologies of bad karma and personal responsibility for the parent's death often occur when there is a history of multiple losses and tragedies. Charlotte Bronte lost her mother to an early death. Soon after, her two older sisters were buried in companion graves. Several years earlier, Bronte survived the death of her brother and her two younger sisters. Following her later loss, Bronte wrote, "I am driven often to wish I could taste one draught of oblivion, and forget much that while mind remains, I shall never forget." Bronte found little respite in her life from the loss and tragedy that seemed to be constantly at her heels. She believed herself to be doomed to a life of sorrow and loneliness. She could not change her unlucky destiny, merely bear her lot with as much dignity as possible. Shortly before her marriage, she wrote, "The evils that now and then wring a groan from my heart lie in my position. Not that I am a single woman and likely to remain a single woman, but because I am a lonely woman and likely to remain lonely. But it cannot be helped, and therefore imperatively must be borne, and borne with as few words about it as may be." Charlotte Bronte wore the taint of death and loss throughout her life. Jocelyn's story. Closer to the little ones that are behind that. Jocelyn's story. Jocelyn has buried so many relatives that Bronte's words might well be her own. Jocelyn was born into a large farming community and grew up with a warm and diverse extended family. As a very young girl, she was the doting companion of her strong and forceful grandfather, who took her with him as he made his daily rounds of the farm. Jocelyn first encountered death when she was only 5 years old, when her grandfather died. Because he was her grandfather, however, and not her father, his death was mourned, but did not send shockwaves throughout the family. When only 3 years later, his eldest son, Jocelyn's father, died tragically of a slow illness, the family and Jocelyn were beside themselves. Jocelyn remembers being her father's constant companion, just as she had once been her grandfather's. She was a tomboy, and she followed her father around like a little puppy. He would take her swimming, play softball with her, and treat her like his special little girl. Jocelyn's final memories of her father are of a thin man who could barely wave to her from the window of his hospital room. When she was not quite 8 years old, Jocelyn began to believe that the people I love die on me. At her father's funeral, Jocelyn remembers being comforted by her father's younger brother, a funny, warm man whose skills as an actor allowed him to entertain his nieces and nephews with stories and charming impersonations. Jocelyn's uncle told her not to worry and that she would always have him now that her father was gone, and that he would be there to love her and take care of her. Jocelyn remembers feeling numb when 1 month to the day after her father's death, this uncle dropped dead of a sudden heart attack. Jocelyn was now convinced there is something about me, perhaps something about the essence I exude that causes the people I love to die. Following the death of her grandfather, her father, and her uncles, Jocelyn, her mother, and her siblings moved away from the farm to a nearby town. Although she was an African American girl from the country, Jocelyn formed an intense friendship with a little white boy from the city. Despite their surface differences, Jocelyn and this boy shared something very important. They had both lost their fathers. They became constant companions, and their conversation frequently centered on their fathers and the loss they shared. As the stories of their missing fathers grew, Jocelyn often imagined that she and this little boy had the same father. Their stories, their memories, and their fantasies were so similar. Each used to say to the other, "Don't worry, it doesn't matter that we don't have fathers, we have each other." Children who lose parents are driven in their search for someone who will understand the loss. Adults often do not know the correct words to use when talking to children about their sadness. Only only another child who has suffered a similar loss seems an appropriate kindred spirit. Sorry about that. Oops, it's getting worse. Not better. Alright, let's finish this up right here if we can. Wow, look at there, I knocked it in. There we go. Three years after she and her friend formed their bond, Jocelyn was left alone once again. Her little friend and his family moved to another town. His mother was remarrying, and the family was relocating to be near her new husband's family. Although this time it was not death that took Jocelyn's friend away, she felt abandoned and empty nonetheless. She spent many days walking by her friend's house, hoping that he might still be there, wishing to catch a glimpse of him, imagining that he might return to retrieve some forgotten object. The search for her lost friend parallels the search many children engage in for the lost parent. In reality, the parent is dead, but the fantasy, the parent, lives on, and the child finds him or herself searching down each new street for a glimpse of the missing mother or father. It is not surprising that by the time she entered adolescence, Jocelyn believed it was dangerous for her to love anyone. Her hypothesis that the people she loved leave was a core part of her personal belief system. Although she is only 40, as an adult, Jocelyn has already lived through the deaths of her mother, her sister, her aunt, and her half-brother. Each time Jocelyn, like Charlotte Bronte, felt assaulted by the force of death, she is convinced that it is her fate to be someone who loses those she loves. Jocelyn did not see herself as causing the death of these loved relatives. Rather, it seemed to her that death was a part of her life, inextricably tied to who she was, and that it was impossible for her to move through the world without dragging the shadow of death behind her. Some survivors of early loss harbor more personal and more casual fantasies about responsibility for the death of a loved one. After the death of her mother when she was only 5 months old, and the loss of her father 15 years later, Tessa was convinced that people left her because she was bad. She reasoned that if she could just be good enough, people would not abandon her. She was not quite sure what good enough meant, but she developed a series of elaborate rituals and routines which she needed to follow perfectly in order to prevent someone else from dying. When Tessa was only 10, her father had his first stroke. That is when she began to believe that if she could be perfect, she could save her father from death. When her father suffered a second stroke 4 years later, Tessa kept vigil in his hospital room. The nurses reinforced her fantasies by telling her that her father ate and responded only when she was in the room. Occasionally, Tessa would be unable to sit by her father's side in the hospital, and she would worry that something awful might happen. On the day her father did die, Tessa had been unable to go to the hospital because of after-school activities. Although no one blamed her for her father's death, Tessa blamed herself. Regardless of how well she did during the rest of her early adulthood, Tessa felt like a failure on the inside. The outside person might succeed, win awards, marry, and have a family, but the woman on the inside felt as if she had failed in her most important task, keeping alive those she loved. In midlife, Tessa received counseling to help overcome her belief that some failure in herself had caused the death of her parents. Although at that time she fully believed that the split inside herself had healed, several years later when her husband had to have surgery, Tessa kept vigil in his hospital room. As she said, "I know I can't cause him to live or die, but I can't take the risk of being left with the guilt if anything bad happens." More common than myths about personal responsibility or bad karma are the fantasies children evolve about who they might have become if their beloved parent had lived. Like the fictional character Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront, many people live with the fantasy, "I could have been a contender." They think if only my mother or father had survived, he or she would have helped me to become my very best self. I would have been someone special, someone accomplished, successful, if I had only had the support and guidance of my parent. At these times, these illusions about the self are pure fantasy, as invented and fabricated as the images of ideal parents. Occasionally, they are based on some real information about the parent who died. Okay, an apocryphal, Apocryphal, an apocryphal story that leads the child to believe a parent would have performed in a particular way. Perhaps more than anything, these fantasies reflect a child's sense that something good died when the parent was taken away, that some spark inside the self that needed parental guidance and nurturing went out with the parent's death. And the last little story is Reggie's story. And that'll finish this little section of chapter 4. Reggie's story. Reggie was only 3 years old when his father was killed in a violent car accident. He had been told by relatives that when tragedy struck, his family was poised for success. Reggie's mother and father had just bought a home in a beautiful suburban community, and he and his sister were healthy, thriving children, and his father had just been featured in a local news story on African American executives on the rise. It was easy for Reggie to mythologize his family story and to create for himself the image of a perfect father who would have provided guidance and mentoring to his young son. Throughout his childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, Reggie frequently thought to himself, "If only my father had lived, I would be somebody special." He imagined that his parents would have belonged to the local country club, and that he would have been part of a select and cool group of people. Instead, Reggie always felt somewhat like an outsider, desperate for the approval of the popular clique. Reggie imagined that he would have shared in his father's elevated status, and that status would have given him a special role with his peers. As Reggie floundered throughout his high school, he fantasized that if his father were alive, his father would not only have given him advice, but would have provided the necessary structure and guidance to keep Reggie on track. Repeatedly, conversations that began, "Son, when I was your age," would filter through Reggie's mind. His father would share stories of his own boyhood, and those stories could be used by Reggie as guides in making decisions and planning for his own future. When he found himself more interested in the social side of school than in the academic, Reggie imagined another conversation in which his father said to him, "Son, school isn't supposed to be fun. It's hard work and you've got to knuckle down." Reggie would look admiringly at his father, nod his head, and say, "Okay, Dad, I've got it." In reality, these conversations might never have occurred. The young son would probably have been more rebellious and less easily led by his father's words of wisdom. Yet in his fantasy life, Reggie imagined his father's guidance, bringing out his own best talents. Reggie also believed that his father would have wanted to create a son of whom he could be proud. Reggie could just picture his father standing around the corporate boardroom, wanting to brag about his son's latest athletic or academic accomplishment. Needing a successful son, Reggie's father would have cracked the whip. He would have made sure that Reggie studied and did his very best. Although in midlife, Reggie is now a successful businessman, he believes that he would have become somebody truly special, and that he missed his opportunity to be a contender when his father died. For Vincent, fantasies about the person he might have been focused on who he would not have become if his mother had lived, to provide guidance and to keep him on the right track. Although Vincent's father was a hard-working man, he spent little time with his son. after his wife suddenly died. Vincent's father had lost his own mother when he was a boy, and consequently he had no first-hand knowledge of what a boy might need from a mother. He reasoned that as long as he kept a roof over Vincent's head and food on the table, he was providing his son with a good life. Unfortunately, Vincent needed more guidance and involvement to stay free of the rough and destructive elements in his neighborhood. Searching for companionship and acceptance, Vincent quickly fell in with the drug-using crowd. Recreational drug use led rapidly to an addiction, which haunted Vincent for much of his adult life. Vincent does not know whom he would have become if his mother had lived, but he is convinced that he would not have become a drug addict and destitute. His mother's guidance, Vincent reasoned, would have kept him safe from the temptations of the street. Although no one else I interviewed suffered as many personal setbacks as Vincent, many people felt that they had been unable to parent themselves as well as they imagined they would have been parented by the one who died. Repeatedly, interviewees said, "I just know she or he would have done a better job in raising me than I was able to do for myself." The next part will be fantasies about the relationship that might have been. We're on page 96 from the book The Loss That Is Forever by Maxine Harris, PhD. I appreciate you listening and watching the river gulls with me today. Thank you so much.